Hi, my name is Will, and I've been a software developer for several decades now. I started working in Silicon Valley for companies like Apple and Symantec in the 90s, and then I moved into consulting in the 2000s. I've written 4 books on software development, and I built and sold an 85-person software development consulting company, which gave me a chance to work with a lot of companies, both startups to the Fortune 500. I've been doing Agile software development since 2004, and I realized when I was chatting with a friend of mine recently that for a lot of folks, if they've only been in the field, say, since even 2010, they've probably never known anything but Agile as a software development methodology. So I wanted to take a few minutes to explain what Agile is, where it came from, why so many people today are upset about it, and what I think is next. So first off, let's talk about what came before Agile. So this goes back to, I'm just going to start with the 80s. Back then, technology project management was kind of getting started. And what a lot of folks did was they adopted best practices that were coming out of places like NASA. So when the space shuttle launched in the 80s, that was a big deal. That was like the height of technology. And so NASA talked a lot about how they'd built out things, including stuff like Gantt charts, which was a way of modeling out a lot of dependencies and then detailing all the requirements in advance and then using that as the basis for shipping the space shuttle. So when you have a new field, when you're trying to figure out how do you manage projects, and then you look to other industries, the metaphor becomes a big part of what informs how you think about it. So of course, what's a cooler thing for a metaphor than the space shuttle, right? So people started adopting the methodologies, this complex set of requirements gathering, and then you go into build, and then you test it, and then you deploy it or ship it. So this model where you're doing that, where you're building things in these stages and then having it come out, was called waterfall. And the idea, you can kind of see from the diagram, it's like the project flows from one step to the other. It's like a nice, comfortable, relaxing waterfall. So this idea that good project management involved building out and documenting all these things and creating all this stuff became its own industry. There were project managers, you'd go get certifications, you'd take classes. This became kind of what the industry trained the executive teams to ask for and look for, right? I should be able to get if you're an executive, you say, hey, I should be able to get a detailed roadmap for the next year or two of work. I'm spending a lot of money hiring all these technical people. They should be able to do this. So the problem, of course, is that waterfall and shipping a space shuttle or even something more smaller scale, like building a house, isn't really a great metaphor for software development. A lot of this gets into just the iterative nature of the work and the fact that you're constantly releasing. And I think this notion about the release is really what drove a lot of the change away from waterfall and really exacerbated a lot of the problems. And specifically, back in the late 80s, early 90s, shipping software meant putting things onto a floppy or a DVD, and then you put it into a box at retail, and then you shipped it. Or you went around and you installed it on everyone's computer. And if you have 50,000 people working in a company, going through and installing that on everybody's machine was kind of a big deal. And so getting to a release was kind of this big bang thing. Where this kind of all starts to fall apart is when you start trying to shift to a server deployment model. And what I mean by that is, if shipping just means, well, we copied the software onto the server, maybe we bounce the server and then it's deployed. You could do that 20 times a day if you want. You could do it 100. And so certain aspects of the waterfall methodology, including this notion of crunch. And the idea with waterfall was that you'd get to this period where it's like all hands on deck. We're going to fix all our bugs. We're going to lock everything in. We're going to ship. As part of the cycle, started becoming kind of normal. And the idea there is like, if you think about early internet hype days where it's like, we're going to ship something, and if we ship this new feature in 2 weeks, then we get a big win, right? So you get to this rhythm of wanting to build and deploy a lot more frequently. And I think it's really important to highlight just how miserable and horrible people found waterfall in practice. By the mid-90s, you start seeing books like Death March by this guy, Edward Jordan. And it's really just highlighting this notion of how projects, when they start to fail, you start getting into these problems. And so what you'd get is when waterfall projects would fail, the project managers would say, well, we're going to miss our date. But because we're missing our date, that gives us an opportunity to do some more feature work. And so you'd have literally project managers just starting to snowball bad news and then more work and then bad news and then more work. And it got out of hand. So by the early 2000s, people were already primed for a change in how you manage projects. And this is where Agile starts to come in. Okay, so what is Agile? Agile, capital A Agile, is a term that comes specifically from the Agile Manifesto. And if you look at the Agile Manifesto, what you'll see is it's really a declaration of basic principles. And when I read it, what I see is a declaration of human rights. So it doesn't mean flexible. And you'll see, this is how I know that you've got a bad technology executive if they've never even heard of Agile or they just think it means being flexible. The most important one, I think, is the first piece on this list, which is human interactions over process and tools. And if you stop and think about it, I think this is why Agile is controversial even to this day. The thing is that if you want to make Agile work, you still have to come up with process. And so right out of the gate, you have this conflict. On the one hand, it's all about human beings and they should matter. But you want process to be able to get some structure and get some work done. So the first Agile process that really went mainstream was Scrum. Scrum was popularized through a 2-day training course. And the idea was that you could go to this training class, you'd sit for 2 days, you'd go through some really cool stuff, some exercises, and then at the end, you'd get your Scrum Master certification, which was like a little certificate, which you needed for a lot of companies to even get training. One of the things that I always thought was very interesting about Scrum training classes was how much of the training was really about just getting managers to get away from the command and control structures, right? So one of the exercises that was very memorable was you'd say, I'm going to organize into 2 groups of people to cross a room. One group of people can only move when they're given an order by a manager. The other group of people are given a high-level directive, cross the room. And then the point was to illustrate how much quicker people cross the room when you just said, can you all please cross the room, as opposed to directing everyone who had to move step by step. So what's interesting about that is that a process training, or is that more like therapy, right, for command and control folks? And I think this is part of where Agile started to become much more important on an emotional level for a lot of folks. Because the idea, especially early on, was, well, if you adopted the processes and then you were kind of in the club, that meant that you also were bought into the other pieces, like that humans matter, right? So the Scrum processes themselves are actually fairly simple. Initially, it might have been a month, then it was 2-week sprints. You do daily stand-ups, which have a specific structure to them of what did you do, what are you doing, and any blockers. You do retrospectives, you do a demo, and then you also have a lot of stuff around backlogs. You basically have a pile of work, and then each 2 weeks you sign up for the work that you're going to do. So the Scrum process stuff is fairly straightforward. The other process stuff that started to come out around then was something called XP, developer-centric aspects of trying to achieve these Agile models. Today, the things that you might recognize that come directly from XP include things like unit testing and automation, automated testing, and also CI/CD is an evolution of the best practices from that. So by the mid-2004s, Agile starts to really take off. And the failure rate on waterfall was so high that it really wasn't a surprise that people were looking for something different. This real interesting combination. You've got the developers liking certain aspects like unit tests and things like that. You've got project managers who view Agile as a different methodology. Some of them might say that it's different aspects of the iron triangle around scope and requirements and timeline and resources. So you're pivoting. So they were able to kind of wrap their head around it. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was one of my first clients that we worked with adopting Scrum as a process referred to it as a really good communication plan, which I thought was very interesting. The other thing, of course, is that Agile fixed how contracting would work for consulting firms. If you said to somebody, I'm going to sign up to do a bunch of work, it's going to take 90 days to do it, or 120, and then you get to the end and the client's not happy, now you have a brutal negotiation process to go through. So instead, if you switch to ideally weekly or at least every 2 weeks, that rhythm and that cadence, suddenly you're configuring and you're reconfiguring and you're changing the dynamics of the relationship in really good ways. So now we have this challenge. We've got a new process, a new system for how to do things. You've got a lot of folks that used to sell waterfall that are now frankly panicking because all of a sudden nobody wants to take all those classic training classes. And you've got Scrum. So you start out with that 2-day training class. So if you say it's 20 people in a class and you charge $1,000 a person for a Scrum Master certification, you're starting to get into some good money. Now let's say you win a contract and you're going to teach that 2-day class to a company with 50,000 people in it. That's a lot of money. And so this is where things start to go a little weird for Agile. Who is Agile for? Is it for the individual developers, the development teams? Is it for project managers? Is it for the executives? Or is it for training and consulting companies? Either way, by the early 2010s, Agile had completely replaced Waterfall. So some of the things that people really picked up quickly were the technical processes. If you need to support shipping software daily or weekly, then you have to do things like unit testing and automated testing, or you'll go insane. Each of these topics could be its own video, and it's a whole broad spectrum of stuff, but that's where you see these things coming from. Now, the flip side, though, is that by the 2010s, you also start to see things going a little sideways. And the issue is that if you're a command and control manager, it's really shockingly easy to subvert the processes of, say, Scrum in particular. And what I mean by that is by the mid-2010s, I would go into a client and I would ask them about their process, and they'd say they were doing Agile and Scrum. And then I would sit in on some of that. And so they were doing things like 1-hour daily stand-up meetings, right? They would do retrospectives, but the retrospectives took on more of a flavor of a political trap. If a developer came in and said anything in the retrospective that was critical of management, they would be held accountable for that in a bad way. And so people got very cynical about it. Another part of this was the backlogs becoming a tool to enforce crunch. So you'd have a manager who would say something like, well, you made your commitment for your 2 weeks. If you don't hit your date, that's on you. And even if you'd say something like, well, I've been waiting for a dependency for a team outside the group, the manager could say, well, that's your problem, not mine. You need to hit your dates and your deliverables. And so this is the problem, is that you get into this weird thing about like, well, is that Agile? Is that Scrum? Is that what's going on? And what happened to the human side about humans are important, right? If we chuck that out of the window, it's pretty easy to take all this process stuff and turn it into something that can be kind of abusive. So what this meant was that by the mid-2010s, I basically stopped talking about Agile. And the main reason for that was because the word by itself didn't really convey a lot of meaning. Somebody could say they were doing Scrum and it was meaningless, right? Because of how these things would get distorted. So what I wound up doing instead was focusing on the actual process that people are using. So instead it would be a conversation with them. I'd say, well, what are you doing and how do you do it? And get them to talk about it and then think through it. The other thing that I will note is that by the mid-2010s, you started seeing Kanban boards appearing as an alternative to the traditional Scrum tooling. This, in my book, is a really good idea because if you use a Kanban board, it starts to make you think about things in terms of the flow of the work. How do you get from an idea or a feature? What are all the stages and steps that it needs to go to get it into production? And one of the challenges with that is most organizations, they have some sort of cross-functional component to them. And what I mean by that is you might have like an integrated couple of developers and maybe some test and some project management, but you have to work with an ops team to deploy it. Or maybe you're building your project and there's a brand team or a legal team or something that you have to send work to. Kanban boards allow you to break up the work into different pieces and then be able to track and manage it in a way that I think is a lot closer to how big companies actually work. The other thing that happens is by the mid-2010s, the Agile movement and the industry around it is starting to struggle a bit. By that point, most folks either have taken a Scrum training class or there's enough online material or what have you. In a sense, it's because it became the de facto way to build things. But if you're an Agile consultant and you're trying to continue to sell training classes and coaching work and things like that, now you have a little bit of a challenge of what is that next thing you're going to sell. And this is where the Agile consulting folks, I think, started to really focus on selling scaled Agile. And the idea there is that if you're already talking to an executive, especially somebody, that 50,000 person company, right? You want to sell them the executive team, a way to manage all those teams and deal with things like your portfolio. And implicit in that is you need complexity. And so that's where you get something like SAFe. So this is the diagram for SAFe. this is so far away from human interactions over process. I don't really know what to make of it. And I don't know that it's necessarily catching on or becoming the next thing. And so that's the challenge, is what is that thing for the consulting and the training folks to focus on, especially as we get into the 2020s and beyond. Okay, so with all that in mind, I want to take a moment just to kind of make some concrete suggestions for folks. So first of all, if you're a candidate or if you're a job seeker and you're looking to try to get through an interview loop, I would recommend, instead of trying to get dogmatic or insisting on particular process things or what have you, what I would suggest is when you go into the interview, ask about the flow. Just say, like, look, if let's say there's a bug report that comes in, can you describe to me how that bug report goes from the front end, comes into the system, goes into some work queue, and then how does it get stepped through? And if you ask that, what you'll get is more information, hopefully, about things like their process. Do they use unit testing, CI/CD? And so you can have that conversation. Same thing about, like, do you guys do stand-ups? How long do those meetings usually last or not? And so instead of it being an argumentative thing, it's just a recognition of where they are. And you might ask questions, right? Like you might say, well, that's interesting. What are some of the challenges that you're having with the flow? That's going to be a much more productive conversation. For another example, ask about how a new feature gets run through the system. How do they prioritize the work? And what you'll find is just every company has its own little complex evolution that they've developed for how to do this. I would still go ahead and read up on Scrum, read up on XP, read up on Kanban. These are all very good tools to have in your toolbox. So next up, let's say that you're the manager of a small team and you're trying to figure out how to put things together. Look at things like Kanban boards for tracking the work. One of the first things I'd look at is making sure that the columns are correct, right? So if you have all these different columns on the board, are they the right columns, and are you tracking the cycle time? You might want, the typical task might be a half day or a day long tasks, and you want to ideally just keep the pump kind of flowing through with the work and people still being productive without feeling overwhelmed. This also will help you manage the politics of dealing with other groups within your company, because then you can start pulling out and getting clarity to develop things like velocity reports for how much of the work is sitting in your team, and how much of the time is your team spending waiting for someone else in another team. The technical term to look up for that is cycle time, and that's part of Lean, which is also a great thing to explore and learn more about. So it could make for a good video, maybe. Another one, especially if you're getting into the executive level where maybe you've got 50 or 100 or more people that you're trying to manage, thinking about your organizational design and bringing in a coach is probably a good idea. So even though you may have seen that I've been somewhat critical of some of the Agile components, I do think that bringing in a good Agile coach or just a software development coach who's familiar with all these different methodologies to come in and help you put together plans for how to do organizational design, how to do improvements is really good. And I would note that your ideal candidate for something like that is going to be someone who has some expertise with the technical stack, who can also help with the technical components. But what I mean by that is, a really common thing that I saw with a lot of teams, especially in bigger companies, was that their source control systems, their technical debt levels were really high, but if you have non-technical management, they don't really understand what's going on. And the coach can be a really powerful way to kind of bridge the gaps. There are other ways of doing this, obviously, but that's an example of something that a coach can help out with quite a bit. Just to kind of tie it back together, Agile is a wrapper for a lot of different methodologies, a set of principles that then drive out everything from Scrum to Kanban to XP to what have you. So here's the thing. Agile won because it's everywhere. I mean, almost every company claims to do Agile today. A lot of the techniques and tools are just standard software development things. But here's the thing. In a really fundamental way, I kind of feel that Agile lost. And the reason I say that is because that declaration of human values, that humans matter more than process, I think that got lost. I think that fell by the wayside. And I think that's sad. And I would like to think that in the future, we're going to figure out other ways to bring that up. But the most basic thing I would say is, Agile is not a proxy for good management or bad management, right? Agile won't fix bad management or malevolent management. It can be a really powerful tool and a great help. But at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff's going to just boil down to the nature of the human being that you're working with, your bosses, and also the nature of the company that you're at. In any event, my hope is that we go into the next decade, we keep innovating as an industry. And a big part of that is going to talk about what are the new techniques and strategies for how we're going to both sort out our labor and management issues, how we're going to work together as teams, how does the software industry continue to deliver, and how do we go back and forth on managing all this stuff. I would be quite sad if people just said, well, Agile and XP and Kanban, that's it, we're done. We've figured out software development, how to run projects, we're good. So I'm hoping that as we go into the future, we continue to innovate and come up with new cool things. And with that, if you have any ideas about the future of project management in the software development field, go ahead and pop something into the comments. I'd love to see what you think. My hope is that we figure out better ways to manage our projects, and somehow we can figure out a way to bring the human side of Agile back into the conversation. If you have any ideas about this, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. And thank you very much for your time. Take care. Bye. All right, I'm waiting for the first person to put AI just takes over everything in the comments.